It is no secret that work has begun on creating a 5th edition of Werewolf the Apocalypse, and while Hunters Entertainment are no longer involved in the production, as far as I know, people are still waiting with bated breath to hear any news on what a future edition of this game will entail. I've spent an almost unhealthy amount of time thinking and talking about Werewolf the Apocalypse and its premise, and how one would go about creating a new, modern edition of this game. In fact, I would argue that this game has occupied more of my free time and mind than any of the other Splats. This is doubly weird for me, since I've actually come to realize that Werewolf is one of the Splats I often struggle with the most. This might come as a surprise to some of you, but I actually kind of don't like Werewolf that much. Now, before you turn off this video, I would also like to remind you of what I said just before this. I can't stop thinking about Werewolf. And in terms of mythology, I vastly prefer werewolves to any other supernatural creatures. So a lot of that thinking time was actually spent trying to constructively put into words what it is that I don't like about Werewolf, and how I would go about changing it, if, I was in charge of that. And could also hide under a rock for the rest of existence, as fans of the game series would try to hunt me down and skin me for my design choices. Now, I lack any and all insight into the creation process of either the old Werewolf the Apocalypse or W5, so I have no idea if the issues I will be covering in this video are even remotely related to what the authors were and are struggling with. But I have a sneaking suspicion that some of what I will bring up in this video may actually be the reason why production of W5 might be a little rough. So to begin with, I will list some of the most glaring issues with the setting of Werewolf the Apocalypse in terms of lore and premise, as I perceive them. Now granted, I'm well aware that there is no right way to play Werewolf. I mean, I literally made a video about that like 2 weeks ago, so everything I talk about here is basically what is keeping me from enjoying the setting as it is written. So I'm fully expecting people to disagree with me, and that's perfectly fine, but I'll do my best in explaining my reasoning for why I think the way I do. Maybe I'm not getting Werewolf. Maybe I don't get it. And believe me, I kind of feel that way too, but here's at least my take on it. I honestly think that the Apocalypse is one of the biggest hurdles for updating the setting of Werewolf the Apocalypse. It's literally right there in the name. Practically everything in this splat is telling us that we're fighting a losing battle as the Garou. We are forced to deal with a shit hand dealt to us by short-sighted ancestors who made enemies with the other Fera, who severely weakened Garou tribe relationships, and who more or less squandered every opportunity they had to nip the problems of our world in the bud. Wolves are rapidly approaching extinction, black spiral dancers are exploding in population, humanity is growing increasingly disconnected with nature and the balance of it, and Pentics are happily expanding their business model and are showing no signs of stopping. It is a time of last stands, of desperate struggles, of unlikely alliances, and of course of heroism. But that was like 20 years ago. Now I know there's a meta plot that provides a couple of hooks for how hope could be reignited in the werewolf community, but that didn't really reflect too much in the core writing, in my opinion. Werewolf isn't the only game set in the World of Darkness that's dealing with the end times. After all, Vampire has Gehenna, which is obviously looming ever closer and which inspires many of the struggles in the vampire community. But where vampires and werewolves differ is the relationship these two races of supernatural creatures have with their respective end times. In Vampire, Gehenna is kind of a vague, almost mythological concept, and plenty of the kindred in the setting don't even believe in it. It is a debatable issue, and some scholars even argue that it's cyclical, that it's happened before and it will happen again. A lot of times you can play a long Vampire Chronicle where the topic of Gehenna is barely broached. It's not something the entire setting hinges on, but it provides ample inspiration for paranoid elders, fanatic Sabbat warriors, and other threats and challenges to the player characters. Werewolf, however, is pretty blatant about it. Pollution, extinction, overpopulation, exploitation by evil corporations, these are all signs that the worm is getting stronger, that it's winning. And if you, a Garou, don't take this seriously, you are most likely going to get shut down or even ostracized by your fellow Garou. It is a commonly accepted state of being. The world is on the brink of destruction. You have failed in your task. Gaia is doomed. I mean, it's not entirely in black and white, but I would definitely argue that any guru who would try to bring up the possibility of, say, maybe the apocalypse being cyclical, or that the worm destroying everything might actually be a good thing, would at best find themselves avoided by their septmates, but most likely given a severe beating or even be killed, because that's back spiral dancer talk. So how do you even progress the meta plot of a setting like this? Where do you take it next? It's not like we've magically made the world less polluted since the 90s, and honestly, most of the threats described in those books are almost childishly naive to people living in the 2020s. And on the other hand, if you don't want to change the premise, what's the point of releasing a new edition? And this kind of weaves into my next issue, which is when writing my videos for the Splat, I had a harder time pinning down the overarching metaplot of Werewolf. SPCs and important sets and cairns were not quite as easy to find as their equivalents were in Vampire the Masquerade. But I know they exist, they're just very spread out amongst the books. And as far as I know, there have been few attempts to consolidate the factions and groups into books specifically about them. There's no Player's Guide to the Garou Nation, although I've been informed there's an older Who's Who Among Werewolves book that at least gives us some insight into important SPCs. But this still makes it difficult for a lot of people to get a decent grasp of international Garou relationships and politics. And yeah, I definitely think the Garou are political. I think there's a lot of backroom dealings and betrayal and deceit going on. I mean, just look at the relationship between the Silverfangs and the Shadow Lords. And what was up with the Stargazers leaving? There's a whole story behind that. So when there's not an awful lot of work put into consolidating information on the infrastructure of Garou society, that's a mouthful, it's kind of hard to have games that are not about the apocalypse. I mean, that's not necessarily bad. But, as I was saying with my previous point, it's difficult to progress beyond the apocalypse. There's only really three outcomes to it. Either we win, and how would that look? We lose, which would make for a pretty bleak game, or the apocalypse wasn't really going to happen or hasn't happened yet. Kind of like the Gehenna Wars, I guess. But what Vampire has that I feel Werewolf lacks is the kind of internal, self-sustaining dramatical role-playing. The closest thing to this would be the Sept, but as there are usually only a couple of packs to a Sept, and all of its members are hopefully trying to stop the apocalypse from happening, any kind of politicking will probably be seen as misguided and inviting disaster. If it's present in an adventure, it's often seen as a direct obstacle to success. The pack will have to make two rivals come to terms so that the Sept can become stronger, or it's resolved in a duel and the strongest fighter gets to decide what we're doing. I personally see a lot of potential for internal struggles in the werewolf community, least of all the fact that werewolves are really, really bad at what they're supposed to be doing, which is to prevent the apocalypse. They've really shat the bed on this one. Generations of werewolves have been trying to do this and have been consistently failing due to infighting, short-sightedness, or just plain incompetence, or because they were meant to fail. Isn't it a little strange then that most of the time the solution to stopping the apocalypse is presented in pretty much the same way as werewolves have always been doing it? Destroy the symptoms of the worm's corruption wherever they show up, which usually translates to kill Fomori, banish Banes, destroy factories. And follow the litany, of course. There's often vague allusions to how the root of the problem needs to be fixed, but that never really seems to amount to anything. It's just a smug little aside from the authors which kind of highlights the Garou's inability to properly deal with these issues. Why do we not have a faction of Garou who challenge these perceptions more strongly? I know that, for example, the Children of Gaia or the Glasswalkers are doing things very differently from the others, but even then it's seen as a sort of quirky, naive way of handling the issue rather than a legitimate alternative solution. They're consistently being told they're not looking at the big picture. I would vastly prefer there to be a rift in the werewolf community over which direction to take the fight, with both sides having both valid and less so arguments for their cause, than for those who challenge the laws of the litany to be considered weirdos or outsiders. The Glasswalkers are one of the few tribes who legitimately try to work from inside the system and break down the root of the problem rather than the symptoms. Yet this tribe is often mocked or outright hated by other tribes, and they're often described as being dangerously close to the Weaver. But honestly, if a pack of glasswalkers bring down an entire Pentex subsidiary by crashing their stocks, that's way more damage done to the enemy than dozens of Fomori gutted at a logging site. V5 brought the Anarchs back to the front as an alternative faction to challenge the Camarilla, which in my opinion provided more nuance than the Camarilla versus the Sabbat of previous editions, where it was much easier to create a dichotomy of good versus evil, although of course there was a little bit more depth to it. But generally, in Revised Edition, the Camarilla is presented as this, natural organization to be a part of. It's the good guys, in a sense. Although, of course, they're not good. But young versus old and progressive versus conservative is definitely something I would expect in a community like the Garou. Younger people will challenge the perception of the older generations, and probably the many, many failures of their ancestors, and they may be right. Or they may be wrong. I mean, it's quite possible that the Garou just need to throw another 1,000 bodies onto the problem and that'll be what breaks the camel's back, right? And speaking of problems. What exactly does the Wild do? How does it differ from the Wyrm? I know this is borderline heretical for me to bring up, but I've kind of always had a big issue distinguishing the Wild from the Weaver and from the Wyrm. I know the Wild is supposed to represent creation, untapped chaos that brings life to the world, uncontrolled, unmaintained, unstoppable, ever-changing. Yet the Weaver, as far as I know, is the one who gave form to all of life. It created structure, predictability, and of course preservation. If the Weaver did not exist, we probably wouldn't have different species of animals. The Wild is raw creative energy, which I would assume then could be likened to chaos. And generally when I think of chaos, I think of things not being permeable. Nothing really lasts in chaos. It is unpredictable, unsustainable. Perhaps it did create those shapes that the Weaver then maintained, but if the Weaver hadn't, it would have just continued to mutate and changed things. So wouldn't it make more sense if there was a dichotomy, that is to say 2 opposing forces, rather than 3 forces? Yeah, I know, madness, but hear me out. The Weaver represents continuity, structure, order, time, memories, plans, everything that lasts and progresses from point A to point B. At the beginning and at the end of that is the Wild and the Wyrm, right? Yet, while the Wild has more in common with the Wyrm than the Weaver, it is often presented as a positive force. It's rare for you to be fighting Wild spirits, or for a place overrun by the Wild to be considered bad. Yet I would argue that a Wild-tainted place would be equally, if not more, horrifying than one dominated by either of the 2 triads. Imagine your body changing uncontrollably, growing new limbs or aging or de-aging or losing its shape entirely, becoming just a boiling, roiling puddle of flesh. The changes the Wyrm does to the body of a Fomori, for example, seem to me more akin to what a Wild might do. The Wyrm destroys and breaks down. Why would it grow new limbs, organs, and the like in their agents? I may be misrepresenting the Wild here, or understating its importance, but to make it distinct from the Weaver, which again creates permeance and form, you kind of have to think of the Wild as being at least a little bit dangerous, right? And I know for a fact that the Wild, the Weaver, and the Wyrm are supposed to be representative of a kind of druidic way of thinking of nature in terms of 3 rather than 2, so I know there's a lot of religious and theological background to it, so I'm not trying to dismiss that. So if you're dead set on keeping the Triad, which I'm by no means against, it might be a good idea to figure out what exactly is meant by balance, and sort of reconsider what the Wild is. I don't think it's a good idea to say that the Wild represents wilderness, forests, untamed wildlands and so on, because these areas are still systems. Yet this is an idea I've seen even in official Werewolf the Apocalypse material. We often talk about ecosystems when we discuss nature, and the vulnerability of these areas, and how all life is codependent, and how introducing new elements into these balanced environments can bring disaster as they lack any natural predators. And I don't think that either the Weaver or Wyrm should be capable of introducing new and unknown elements into a system, or would at least be against it. Even decay is simply the bacteria and insects around us breaking down dead matter. But you know what is all about new stuff and changes? The Wild. The Wild is probably just as destructive and unpredictable as the Wyrm, just in a different way. Life springs anew from deceased remains. Evolution is just an endless cycle of birth and death. The Weaver, meanwhile, wants nothing to change and everything to remain the same. A dichotomy of chaos versus order, or even life versus death, makes a lot of sense to me. It's at least worth considering, but even if the official explanation in the setting is the Triad, and it might even be the truth, I don't see why some Garou may not consider this aspect. Unlike us, however, who are completely detached from communicating with spirits, the Garou meet them on a regular basis. In a sense, this gives them direct proof of the way of how things work, but I also think that spirits are by their very nature highly unreliable narrators. They don't see the world like we do. They don't see time pass or things change, and I would imagine that they communicate in a highly symbolic and metaphorical way. Why can't there be spirits who instead explain existence as a duality instead of a trinity? And as for the changes the worm does to its agents, I can see how that is the worm doing more than its role requires of it, as it's been driven to madness. That in its delusion it's trying not just to destroy, but to create as well, and that is why the Fomori are inherently unnatural and abhorrent. But then that's definitely a theme worth exploring more as well. To become a Garou, you most often have to carry the Garou gene, and even then, there's a high probability you'll never become a werewolf, but rather just stay kinfolk. This premise kind of immediately paints your character into the corner of not actually being chosen for the task given to you, but rather just have it thrust onto you because of who your parents were. It's a deterministic outlook on who gets to fight for Gaia, and the topic of inheritance doesn't come up nearly as much as it should in Werewolf, and when it does, it's usually in primarily a positive light. You may have a strong connection to your ancestor spirits or your previous life, and your bloodline might carry respect in the Garou nation despite you not actually having done anything to deserve this respect. And certain flaws might have your ancestor instead having been a particularly bad Garou for one reason or another, but that's again a flaw, and something that's completely voluntary to pick with your freebies. Now, immediately what this does is that it kind of tells you that your player character might not actually want to fight for Gaia, but they should want to, because they are her chosen warriors. They have powers and abilities that will help them to do so, and their community expects them to do it. A Garou who doesn't want to fight for Gaia, even when told that they should, and even worse, who doesn't fight for Gaia, is immediately thrust out of the community, or even killed. They're bad werewolves. So in essence, this is entirely about communal expectations on your player character, and not really about a personal commitment at all. You may want to help Gaia, but really that's not relevant since you should do it anyway. This feeds into my perception that the Garou nation really kind of sort of brainwashed our young recruits into becoming Gaia's warriors by talking about destiny, predetermination, and of course ostracizing anyone who objects to this. They are creating a kind of a narrative where you have no choice in your actions. You have to fight for Gaia because your parents boned and none of your siblings by chance were born as werewolves, and you're of a dying breed, so if you don't fight for Gaia, then who will? In Vampire the Masquerade, the relationship between a vampire and their sire is almost never left unsaid. Even when that relationship is non-existent, it has a strong impact on the player character. A vampire is never born, they are chosen by another vampire. And this is a fundamental difference between werewolves and vampires, because vampires then have a highly personal relationship with their undead nature and those who made them that way. Many might argue that Gaia chooses who becomes a werewolf, but we also know that unless you have the Garou gene, you won't. So it's already decided who may or may not be werewolves, or kinfolk for that matter, and while your relationship with your parents might play a key role if you wanted to, Garou tend not to live for very long, so you might not even know them. Or your parents are kinfolk and thus you two will never be able to have comparable lives. I'd argue that this limits your options when creating a character quite severely, and it also creates a narrative of being outsiders. You were special from birth, standing out from the crowd, and you are not like the other humans. You never were, even before your change. This is not the only Splat that deals with this, but I think that, considering how important of a role humanity plays in the destruction of our planet, it's a bit of a missed opportunity how little interaction Garou have with humans who aren't stooges of Pentex or one of its many subsidiaries. In fact, the curse of the Garou basically makes any human with willpower lower than your rage actively avoid you, meaning that there's barely any humans on this planet who will willingly engage on a rune in a conversation, let alone spend a night with them. Unless they're kinfolk, of course. Which just perpetuates the idea that ordinary humans have no role in this game aside from being the bad guys. This design choice is baffling to me, because it alienates the Garou from humanity. The Ragabash, the most social of the auspices, will have little incentive to boost their rage stat, because that means they will make a statistically significant group of people not want to interact with them, which will limit the abilities they have with their charisma-focused character. Ultimately, Werewolf is not a game about humanity. It's not a game about right or wrong, of committing sins and feeling regret about it. There is no humanity stat. Your renown is based on laws that differ significantly from our perceptions of good and bad deeds, and you will never have to stop and think if you're doing the right thing when you're gutting a couple of Pentix security guards, because they signed up for a gig where they're working for this setting's hexes. You are monsters, but you're monsters for a good cause, so that justifies whatever carnage and murder that you bring on these people. It's really weird that you can play as Wolfborn Garou. While I think it's a neat idea, this makes you even less connected to anything outside of Garou society. You're way smarter than other wolves, so I'm sort of unsure how comfortable you'd be around non-sentient animals, even if they look like you and you grew up with them. But even assuming that being around wolves is cool with you, you enjoy their company and the simplicity of it, aside from boning another wolf, which you know you should be doing as it is your Gaia-given duty as Garou, what would hanging with wolves even accomplish? Wolves don't have societies like humans or Garou do. Wolves don't wage war, they don't amass artifacts or sacrifice their lives for a noble cause. And they certainly don't cause pollution. They're animals. Sure, they'll fight for their pack, they show affection, and they have a whole range of other emotions, but a lot of what makes Garou the Garou much more resemble human culture than wolf culture, in quotation marks. Arguing that wolves are more spiritual or nobler is something we kind of project onto them. It's us anthropomorphizing them, just like in fables. We have done this for thousands of years, but that doesn't mean it's true. And this goes for spiritual beliefs as well, because whether or not we believe in them, I am pretty sure it wasn't a wolf or a reindeer who taught us about spirits and totems back in the day. They inspired them, of course, and there are spirits of animals in this setting, but does that necessarily make animals more spiritual by default? And if that is the case, is a lump of depleted uranium more spiritual than a human being? Seeing as the aforementioned uranium can actually create bane spirits, and that most humans don't become spirits when they die. In fact, more often, it seems to be the memory of such a person that becomes a spirit. I will of course accept the idea that wolves are much more in tune with nature, and I'm sure that Garou who socialize with wolves a lot will get a lot better at surviving in the wilds, tracking down their prey, and maybe even getting better at chillaxing. But wolves don't have rituals or deeply spiritual conversations. You may get closer to nature by hanging out in the woods and living off the lands, but I don't think that the wolves by themselves are a necessity for that. But even so, even if wolves are more spiritual in this setting, they are much further divorced from humanity and the imbalance in their relationship to nature, meaning that Lupus Garou's stake in the fight is even more vague. They are victims fighting back, rather than part of the problem. It presents the narrative in a completely different light, and I think it doesn't mesh well with the Hamid Garou or the overarching themes of Werewolf. I will say this, however, the Red Talons, I believe, are probably the best representation of wolves amongst the Garou. They see a problem, and they think we should get rid of it. There's no room for empathy or understanding or compromise. To them, it's clear where the evil originates from, and it needs to be unrooted. Yet these are often painted in a dark light in this setting, as their lack of tolerance or desire to compromise is often painted as too extreme for most Garou, which hinges on Garou actually caring about humanity, which we've also seen multiple times they are given very little reason to actually do. So, now that I've completely alienated anyone who finds any kind of joy in Werewolf the Apocalypse, I guess this is where I present my ideas for how you might change things up from the established premise. But before I do that, please believe me when I say that these are my own personal opinions. I've legitimately had some really good times just letting loose and being Gaia's chosen warrior. I have a lot of good memories in Werewolf where I've been run through and I've ran deeply spiritual and moving sessions of roleplay, where I've felt justified in my rage and where I've had genuine drama and joy. I wouldn't be doing this video if I didn't at my core love Werewolf the Apocalypse, even if I might not get it. I know this is an incredibly weird thing to hear me say right now after I spent the last couple of minutes just full on blasting the entire game's premise, but I think now, more than ever, a game like Werewolf the Apocalypse is needed. We know what's happening in the world, and a game that outright addresses environmental destruction captures the zeitgeist so much it's insane that W5 isn't out yet. So how would I go about changing the settings of W5? Well, here's 5 different things I would try to bring into the game. Probably not together, but like different approaches. Why should Gaia's chosen be decided through birth and not conviction? There are plenty of people out there who are doing the best they can to save our planet, and a lot of times it's a losing battle, and the sheer frustration and feeling of insignificance an individual might suffer is the perfect reason to empower them. If you want to create a game where individuals can make a difference, make it so that those who furiously defy the destruction of our planet are imbued with the power to do something about it. Not only will this create more Garou, it will also radically change the infrastructure of their society, and it will give much more agency to those who change. No longer are you taught that you need to save the world, but rather your own conviction burned so strongly that Mother Nature herself chose you as her warrior. You can still decide to resolve the situation through violence, that is after all what many might choose to do, but this kind of change might also come later in your life, meaning you might find a disillusioned lobbyist or an exhausted community college teacher suddenly growing fur and turning into werewolves. And why stop there? Have all the fair go through this. Suddenly you have people with 40, 50 years of experience entering the Garou nation and bringing outside perspective and ideas into their midst. This also promotes the idea that humans are important. What exactly is it that triggers the change? Can the Garou actually artificially create new Garou by doing this? Can they convince humans to the point that they will undergo a change? All of a sudden this becomes a hotly debated issue, where some Garou will argue that this might just be a worm plot to lower their guard, to others saying that this is evidence that they should work even closer together with humanity to resolve the issue. Not only will this add more bodies to the fight, it will also completely deflate the Garou nation's self-destructive idea of inheritance and tradition. In their eyes, nothing will show their own failure as clearly as Gaia deciding she needs to look elsewhere for her saviors. If you don't like the idea of Gaia picking humans at random, it's not too much of a stretch to imagine that the Garou have been around so long that a large part of human population might just be lost kinfolk. One major drawback to this would, however, be that in a sense it kind of bypasses the fundamental idea of the Garou having to live with the mistakes of previous generations. It's a strong, core element of the plot's premise, and if you're suddenly able to play as a superpowered environmentalist, you would rob your character of the fact that they're fighting a losing battle because of previous generations. Granted, considering they're humans, it wouldn't be too hard to reflect on the fact that you're suddenly even more acutely aware of the fact that humanity is the root cause for so much of the shit happening to the planet. After all, you suddenly have spirits able to show you the corrupting influence of civilization. You could also, as a twist, just have the change happening to random people, and suddenly they struggle with the idea that they're meant to save the world when previously they might not even have wanted to, or even actively aided in its destruction. What if you're a mid-tier Pentex executive who one day transforms and is shown by Gaia a vision of what their actions are actually doing? It would mesh in the idea that if we want to change the world, we need to find a way to convince even people who don't care, or who actively make the world worse, to stop doing it. And these people could still be more susceptible to the Weaver or Wyrm's influence, meaning they would personally need to struggle in finding the motivation to fight for what they know is right. You could even add a twist on the auspices and say that the circumstances around each new Pharaoh's transformation may in turn be channeled into how they try to save the planet and may in turn influence their auspice. Which brings us to... What if, whenever a Garou becomes Garou, they are also given an individual spirit that serves as their mentor, guide, and linked to the spirit world? Maybe an ancient oak, or a sly fox, or even the spirit of a lake now polluted by some Enron scheme. We know that there are kinfetches, spirits who watch over Garou who have not changed yet, and whose purpose it is to bring their change to the attention of the nearest sept, so that they can be found and tutored. But what if these spirits never leave? They remain with the Garou past their tutoring and become their personal link to the Umbra. What if they come to represent the spiritual half of the Garou? Not only will this bring the spiritual aspect of werewolf to the forefront, it will also add a new layer of role-playing. Perhaps these spirits are also tied to the auspice of the Garou, and that ancient oak got cut down by some unwitting loggers and it's now fueled by rage and a desire for revenge, which might in turn influence the Garou. Maybe they're in a symbiotic relationship, and part of becoming a full-fledged Garou is learning how to live in harmony with this spirit, and the two of you helping each other find a balance in your emotions. And in turn, a harmonious relationship with your spirit will help power the gifts you have learned. Plus, what happens if two patron spirits don't like each other? Suddenly you're unable to cooperate as a pack quite as well, and you will need to turn to introspective dealings in order to figure out what to do about it. Will these spirits in turn poison the relationship between the pact members? What happens if one of the pact members is chosen by a Bane spirit? Can they heal it? Bring it back to the way it would have been if the worm had not been corrupted? Or maybe they will learn some insight into the aspects of the worm that are actually of use to nature. We cannot deny that without entropy, the world would simply not work, and that was the purpose of the worm after all. Of course, this severely diminishes the concept of the pack totem, and if you were to include that in the mix as well, there would quickly be too many spirits to keep track of. One way to resolve this might also be that these patron spirits are not actually SPCs, but rather half of the PC. The Garou are described as being half spirit, half flesh, so perhaps more emphasis could be put on the spiritual aspects. Instead of the spiritual side of a Garou being born along with them, have it be a spirit that merges with them at the time of their first change. So before that, they have this sense of hollowness inside them, that they're not full, they're not complete. There's a lot of parallels that can be drawn between Fomori and Garou. Both are amalgams of spirits and flesh, but the Fomori are like a twisted and dark and obviously inferior reflection of the werewolves. This is an aspect of the lore you could definitely explore more. The Fomori, in a sense, are the worm trying to create their own Thera. Maybe. I don't know if that's heretical of me to say, but that's kind of how it looks like on the outside. I feel that it's almost impossible for me to imagine Garou in the 2020s not being further split into camps, specifically what to do about the growing strength of the worm and its manipulation of humanity. I've been bouncing a lot of ideas around about this, and there's always that risk of becoming vampire but with werewolves when you're talking about young and old or conservationists and progressives, because isn't that just what the anarchs and the Camarilla are doing? And this works well with the idea of the new Garou being added to the mix, but it could also work equally well if you start questioning the whole idea of tribes in Garou. It's really messy to talk about tribes, and it's why I didn't bring it up as one of the issues. Simply because I lacked a proper understanding of, for example, Native American tribes to actually talk about it critically without making even more of an ass of myself. But strictly speaking, it's a little weird to me that there are so many tribes of Garou and that they are so distinct with their own traditions and cultures and ways of living and so on. For one, that Glasswalkers and Bone Gnawers are different tribes seems a bit redundant to me. I also think that a lot of ethnically or geographically bound tribes are really kind of heavy-handed and generic, considering what a wide net has to be thrown to cover the areas they originated from, not to mention that we're also living in an increasingly globalized world. And how do you pick where these tribes are from? Some old cultures don't have any tribes, some have more. Where does that distinction come from? I don't really want to get into identity politics here, but as a person coming from one of these original tribal areas, quotation marks, I can't help but feel that many of these tribes were created without a lot of research done into the specific cultures and people that they were then connected to. There's not a general idea of chest-thumping and Viking pride in Sweden, although there certainly are a notable group who do so, but the ghetto Fenris feel almost prestige and completely incompatible with your average modern Scandinavian. But disregarding that, which I said I wouldn't go into, it also feels a bit weird to me that there would still be distinct tribes when the Garou are short-lived and in small numbers. The average age of your Garou ought to be rather low, and unless there's some hardcore indoctrination going on, I kind of feel that the importance of keeping your line pure at some point just doesn't feel realistic considering the situation the Garou find themselves in. So why not create a division there, between the Garou who believe that the existence of tribes is an actual detriment to their war effort and those who want to hold on to their identities there. These sides are both legitimate and valid. This is probably going to raise a lot of issues though, and might not be the best solution, but it's certainly a situation I could imagine arising within the Garou. You could also have them split more strongly on what their stance on technology and humans are. As I mentioned earlier, I think the Glasswalkers objectively have the best idea of how to beat big business in 2020. You need to destroy it from the inside out, and hopefully also educate the masses about alternative lifestyles, and make those lifestyles accessible. This goes completely against the ideas of some other tribes, and I would like these kind of discussions to take more room in W5. What is the actual way we're going to stop the end of the world? This might actually be a little bit too abstract or vague for role-playing games about raging werewolves though, but I think it could certainly be one aspect of it. It's worth discussing it in the books. And the fact that the Garou are also constantly struggling with their rage adds another level of difficulty for this, one that removes the need for the curse. It just feels like an extra level of otherness when a Garou is already struggling with keeping it together when they're dealing with what they perceive to be evil. You could also create more of a doomsday cultish vibe amongst some of the Garou as well. Have them secretly work towards their preferred view of the apocalypse, convinced that once Gaia is destroyed, a new, better Gaia will be reborn in her place, and in a way that is advantageous to their beliefs. And for an added layer of depth, don't have the worm taint on them. Don't make them Black Spiral dancers, but a genuinely convinced group working towards the end of all things because they believe that will actually be a preferable outcome. The apocalypse may simply be a new beginning, a revelation to the Garou that the world they are in is flawed and a new, better one needs to take its place. Doesn't have to be the truth, it could just be a couple of Garou who think that's what's going to happen. Completely contrary to everything I've said up until now, something else that could completely uproot the game of Werewolf is to limit their ability to travel. Moon bridges in the setting is a convenient way for the Garou to travel between two cairns in a very short time. This is practical, for sure, but it also in a sense cheapens the idea that you're fighting a losing war. If it's easy to get in touch with the other Garou, to call for reinforcement, although that reinforcement may come at a steep price of course, and to generally just meet with other Garou, then again there is little reason to look to humanity for any kind of alternative solution. If you want to construct a feeling of fighting against insurmountable odds, where you have to wage a war smartly to limit your own losses and maximize the damage you may cause the enemy, then promoting the idea of guerrilla warfare is definitely a decision that I think would help hammer home the themes better. Combining this with the collapse of tribes in the Garou Nation, it would create a more intimate, unique community for each cairn and sept that you establish. How would Garou culture develop when there's not a single other group of Garou living within the next, 500 miles? And how much more special would it then be to meet other Garou, to know that you're not alone in this fight? If each and every Garou's death has a massive impact on their small community, suddenly you might not be so gung-ho to run headfirst into combat. And even if you are, it is with the knowledge that while your death may be heroic, it might also completely ruin any future hope your pack will have. Considering again the high stakes of the setting, how much more intense would disagreements then be amongst Garou? Where would they focus their attention? Protecting their cairns? These are literally hotspots for the Wyrm's agents to want to attack, not to mention mages wanting to take their power for themselves. The cairns are a double-edged sword in that they are incredibly valuable to the Garou, but they also tie them down and must constantly be protected lest they fall into the wrong hands or are destroyed. Would the Garou be able to find another source of Gnosis more compatible with their situation, or will they have to strategically sacrifice cairns in order to win a longer battle? And wouldn't this kind of situation invite a more proactive way of playing, where each pack might desperately try to find a way to stem the apocalypse that is not just imminent, but actually happening right now? If you really want to push the apocalypse angle, cut off the Garou Nation completely, and have each sept be its own isolated community with its own peculiarities, their own gifts, their own traditions. Ultimately, these ideas may not at all be what Werewolf the Apocalypse needs. I think, in the grand scheme of things, there's arguments for why it can remain just as it is. When the Onyx Path took over writing for the IP, they generally polished and updated many things in the setting, but they did very little actual changes to the lore, nor did they push the plot progression that much further ahead. So does W5 need to do it? If World of Darkness wants to create a new version of Werewolf, it doesn't have to change anything but the rules. Several other systems have gone through multiple iterations of rules, yet have remained virtually unchanged in terms of setting and premises, aside from some polish and balancing. Do they want to change W5? Again, we have seen behavior pointing in both directions from the company. On the one hand, they introduced quite a few new twists to the formula when they created V5, but this resulted in a very vocal backlash from older members of the community. Did it bring in enough new players to financially justify this potential loss of revenue? I don't have the numbers, so I can't answer that, but World of Darkness recently hired Justin Achille, one of the most, if not the most, seasoned writer and producer of World of Darkness content, and reshuffled their entire production process. There is a lot of changes going on, and many which I personally believe may be attempts to try to bridge the gap to the old fanbase. It may simply boil down to a cost analysis. Will a new edition of W5 generate enough revenue to justify its development, and which way is the most likely to lead to it? Will they make more money just selling what they got on DriveThruRPG? So when Chronicles of Darkness was first released, it was intended as a fresh take on these splats, a new approach to playing these classic movie monsters. V5 wasn't, but was instead technically a continuation of the plot which we saw in Revised Edition, with some modifications and retcons. If W5 is going to be that too, I can't wait to see what they're bringing to the table, and what design approach they will take. There's also the fact that maybe by trying to bring these topics to the fore, I'm completely losing track of what Werewolf the Apocalypse is actually about. There are surely elements and themes in Werewolf that I haven't picked up or missed completely. I'm sure you've been screaming at the screen while listening to this, and my ideas might actually just be completely wrong for this game. Maybe Werewolf just needs to have the auspices or the 5 different forms tinkered with, either expanded upon or shrunk down in amounts. There's just so many different threads you could pull from with this game, and I'm not really jealous of the people who are currently working on a new edition. They really have their work cut out for them. So, what do you think about my reflections on Werewolf? Am I wrong? I mean, obviously I am, but would any of my ideas work for a continuation of Werewolf, or should I leave the writing to the professionals? I'd also love to read in the comments below what your thoughts are, and how you would approach designing a new version of Werewolf the Apocalypse. Let me know, and thank you so much for listening. This was a huge video, it took a long time to make, and my throat is hurting a lot. Also, huge shout out to the Touring, 06, Yudan, Ambihan, Gethomathrox, and Huddy for giving me lots of feedback on this text. I really do appreciate the time you took to give me feedback on these things, and for also pointing out some stuff that I missed. That's it for now. Thank you everyone for listening, and I'll catch you next time. Bye bye. The 3 grandchildren of Cain wait patiently for the time of judgment to arise. Bambi Parsons, a leader with an unbreakable will, Procyon, who has been reborn as a god amongst Cain's angels, and Dougal, whose thirst for blood is matched only by his strength of will and purpose. Their childer, the Methuselah, control our every move through their timeless jihad. They are Her Satanic Majesty Dani, whose mere presence chills the blood, Maximilian S. Hardcastle, a tutor and master of the jihad, Socrates Johnson, a masterful craftsman of stories, Lauren Eason, a trustworthy ally and friend, and Alexander Kishtaria, esoteric scholar and mentor in magecraft. On the Council of the Primogen are seated Edward Reed, Ian Nichols, Raven Fang, the Autumn Alchemist, and Michelle Light, wise leaders and of good judgment. This week, the Council would wish to welcome the elder Jessica Miller to our midst. We hope you will find the company agreeable. We would also wish to give our regards to the Ancile Vex Light, whose service to the Council has not gone unnoticed. Thank you for your support. Naturally, all our elders, Ancile and Neonates receive our gratitude from the bottoms of our hearts. Without your support, this would not be possible. And thank you for watching.